Good evening, everyone. And just a few announcements to begin with. Something I've already made made an announcement about on Canvas, but I do want to bring to your attention. This is to do with the exam and taking it online off campus. All right, so just to reiterate, because the deadline for submitting your application for taking the exam off campus via Ames, as is mentioned here, must be done before the 20th of April. So that must be before tomorrow. So anything that if you contacted me previously, as you can see, it says students who've indicated to their course teachers for taking final examinations off campus also need to submit a request via Ames. All right, so if you contacted me previously with an email following the instruction from the university previously, you still, though, again, need to submit your application, your request via Ames. All right, so please be sure to follow through with this. All right, and please do take note. So this applies to those of you who are who've applied before and who are not going to be. I am taking it to be that anyone who wishes to take the exam off campus needs to submit their request via Ames. So please be sure to follow up with this. The other, excuse me, the other. So I hope that point is clear, and you've please do remember also that if you do choose this option and you're doing it online, off campus, you will need to have the same setup like previously, like last semester, where you will be needing two cameras. So that still applies. And so you do need to be sure that you can manage that requirement. All right, so please take note of this. So the examination on the 12th of May, 6:30 to 8:30. Okay, and for most of you, probably the venue doesn't really apply. But in any case, these are the details. So just to remind you, 12th of May, 2-hour exam. It is open book, as I've mentioned previously. Okay. Today, basically, we'll be reviewing more or less it's the last and final week. So I'll go through sort of what I would consider to be the highlights of what we've been talking about. And so that's what I'll begin to go through with you now. All right. So if I assume that everything is working, and so I'll proceed. We've been basically following the approach, the theory developed by Michael M.A.K. Halliday. And we've looked at sort of how his history, in fact, has perhaps played a role in the way in which his theory has been formulated, the way in which this method has been developed. I do feel in many ways that his experience as a language teacher, not of English, in fact, but of Chinese, the fact that he studied in China under some of China's most well-known linguists, all of this had an impact on the way that he he sees language, the way he approaches language. And of course, he was the founding head of the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. Now, when we talk about Halliday, and we're doing that in terms of what is linguistics, it would be a fair comment to say that systemic functional linguistics is not mainstream linguistics. It is not mainstream linguistics. It is not the most popular linguistic theory and methodology. If you were to say what is mainstream linguistics, well, the name Noam Chomsky would probably come up. A more formal approach to studying language, especially if one is looking at in terms of in the US, in North America, especially what we would call a more formal kind of linguistics is really the mainstream. Now, where has systemic functional linguistics? Where has that? Is it popular anywhere, you might say? And certainly Europe, South America, UK, and of course, China. That's where Halliday's approach has been quite widely accepted and developed. Why this is the case? I think in some respects it still goes back to the politics and the difficulties that Halliday encountered when he first started to when he was trying to sort of locate himself in North America, and the difficulties and the obstacles that he encountered because of his Marxist ideology, that certainly had an impact. So in many ways, we can see it's not really, that's why I feel that because to say something is not the mainstream, it is not to say that it's not the best. And in terms of, I think one really has to, as yourselves, as students of language, you have to really take a look at what do these different theories and methodologies provide you, and to what extent do they really address the needs that you have as a student of language. For me, when I was, because my PhD is from the State University of New York at Buffalo, that's North America. And certainly when I was studying in the university and doing my PhD, I studied formal linguistics. In fact, it wasn't until much later that I became more well aware of Halliday's approach. But once I did become familiar with his approach to the study of language, it impressed me as really providing a way to be able to look at language for what language is, and to really be able to be provided with a way to approach language that enabled one to understand how we in fact use language. Now, Chomsky, the idea being that we basically are inborn, we have an innate knowledge, competence that is logically well ordered with respect to our knowledge of language. And so therefore, a more formal linguistics, formal in the sense of it's interested in the form of language, and with the idea that the form of language is derived from this sort of innate, logical, competence. So, in fact, our grammar, our theory is strives to be logical, almost to the point of being mathematical. It to enable one to be able to study language from that point of view, you do have to idealize what is language, meaning you do sort of have to get rid of certain aspects of language. The point being that when we take a look at what language really is and looking at it as it is used, we realize that it has a lot of ambiguity. It has a lot of where it is. The logic, if it's there at all, is fuzzy, indeterminate. So how do we handle that? Either we can discard it and say we don't pay attention to it, that isn't our concern. That's what's called idealizing language. You try to make it something that, in fact, it isn't. But what's the point of that? What's the point of being able to describe language, even though we may be able to describe it in more logical, in a more logical manner, if in fact that isn't really how language works? It's just our sort of our abstraction of what we want language to be. Halliday takes the stand that what we're really looking at is something that is evolving. It's developing, and it's historical. It's over time, and how it does so is through social interaction. And because that's the case, because it's not really based on some innate logical knowledge or competence, because it is something that we sort of develop. And that's why Halliday prefers the term language development rather than language acquisition. You're not really acquiring something. It is something that's being developed. And it's developed as a child is growing. So what Halliday's point is learning to mean this is a process of creation. You are creating what language is. And a child does this. A child constructs in interaction with those around the child, the caregiver. What the child constructs is, as he describes it, a semiotic potential that gives access to the edifice of meanings that constitute social reality. That's a lot of words that really we sort of need to unpack, and that is that we have the culture itself, what we perceive to be the reality, what we construe to be the world around us, is something built up. It is an edifice. And what have we built up? It's meaning. It is our sense of what is reality. And so this is acquired, this idea of what is real around us and what is the nature of reality, social reality, how we relate to others, all of this, who we are, our identity, all of this is constructed through interaction, through an exchanging meaning. And a child has to go through this process. So it's a very different outlook on what is language. Is it something that you're inborn, it's innate, it's there, and it's logical to begin with? Or is it something that you're developing? Not so much logical as analogical, as we've said. You're resembling how other people speak. Now, as I said before, Chomsky more or less rules out this fuzziness, this indeterminacy. He says it's sort of irrelevant. So what he's getting after is this sort of idealized competence and ruling out messy performance. So your focus isn't on language and use. Your focus is on trying to piece together a logical way of being able to explain what we decide to be grammatical. Now, to me, and I've studied this before, and I've gone through, I'm looking at Chomsky's approach and looking how it developed. But as I studied it, always there seemed to be this it really didn't measure up to what language actually was. Language, instead, Halliday is saying, is inherently fuzzy. You cannot deny the fuzziness and the, as I've said, the indeterminacy of language. So how do we go about understanding how we make meaning? I mentioned this quote before from Stuart Kaufman because I think it really sums up what I've just been saying. Now, what he's saying is that while the human mind, central to our human embodied agency, is sometimes algorithmic, yes, there's some ways in which it works almost like a computer. It's algorithmic, it computes, but, and there's the but, it does some things we do not yet understand. And what is that? How we make meaning. And so what we're wanting is a theory and a methodology that will enable us to indeed find out how we make meaning. How do we make those meaningful choices? Where do we end up? We end up with the text. Why the text? The text is, that is meaning. And that is language. That's actually language in use, the text itself. And so that's where we need to go back to, not grammatical sentences and what we decide. And I say to you a particular sentence, and I ask you, is it grammatical or not? And I try to identify then what is the grammar from that. No, instead, we're interested in looking at the text itself as the basis for what we understand language to be. And what does it mean to say that text is meaning? It's a choice. So what are the choices? What choices do we have that we make? And what Halliday is saying here is that there's lots of options, and those options are almost like in different sets. What are the sets he's talking about? The different kinds of meaning. The ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. And he's saying there's choices in each of those categories, in each of those metafunctions. And a choice that you make, it's not just the choices that you make, it's the choices that you didn't make. It's not just what was said, it's what was not said that defines what is meaning. And so then what is a text? A text is a semantic structure formed, as he says, out of a continuous process of choice among innumerable, interrelated sets of semantic options. There is that's why he talks about it as meaning potential. It isn't really definable. It's not really quantifiable, except maybe in terms of looking at a corpus of data. But actually, again, there you come to the data itself. But that will only tell you the probabilities with respect to the choices that are made. So what are these options? What are these choices? It's the meaning potential. It's the semantic potential. And so this defines what we call the system. of language. The systems are systems of choice. It isn't systematic. There's a lot that is not systematic about language. And that sometimes frustrates students because the expectation is that it should be, if it's a system, it should be systematic. But no, that's not the case here. What we're saying is that language is not systematic, it is systemic. It has the qualities of having a system. And what is that system? It is a system of choices. We understand the choices, and we can talk about those choices. We can look at, and that's our theory, is how those choices are organized in a particular way. Of course, to say it's ideational, interpersonal, textual is of course an abstraction in itself. Any theory, that's why Halliday said every theory is a metaphor for what it's describing. So we have sets of semantic options. Now, Firth, you'll remember Firth, Halliday's mentor. Halliday read what Firth had been writing. It was someone who Halliday deeply wanted to study with. And what Firth was talking about was a systemic linguistics with a sociological component. Meaning that you cannot explain language. You cannot explain it in terms of meaning without also looking at it within the context in which it is used. Within the social context, because what is language? Language is an exchange. You're exchanging information. You're requesting goods and services. You are engaging with, interacting with, and it's through that interaction that you learn what language is, but it is also that interaction that is the purpose of language. And so when he uses the word systemic, he does in the sense that what Firth says, we aim to discover the systems of language and culture realized in the dialogic text, in that dialogue that takes place in a specific context of situation. I like to sum it up like this: we live and we act as conscious and communicative human beings. We are thinking, we are speaking, and we do so in a universe. And that universe is made up of matter, of things, and non-matter, meaning. And the two coexist. They interconnect. This idea of connection, this idea that it is, when we formulate our model of language, we're talking about different strata, different levels. Like there's context, and then context defines in many ways the scope of meaning, and meaning then is realized in the grammar, and so on. So how do we describe the context of situation? How do we take something which is, where do you define the limits? Well, just as we did with language, we said that there is the experiential metafunction, there is the interpersonal, there's the textual. Likewise, we're saying that the context of situation can be defined by those dimensions, the field, what we're talking about, who's interacting, who's talking to whom. How is the activity taking place? Is it through spoken? Is it through written? Is it something you're tweeting, or is it something that you're texting someone, or is it an email, or is it a letter? How are you communicating? Now, another major force in systemic functional linguistics is Ruqayyah Hasan. And Ruqayyah Hasan, we've talked a lot about her with respect to her interest in literature. But she had a lot to offer in terms of looking at this whole idea that comes from Firth about language in a social context. And so she developed what she calls this context metafunction hookup hypothesis. How they go together, how they hook up. So what she's saying is that how you perceive what's going on around you, how you perceive the context is going to activate certain choices of how you're going to make meaning. That's sensible. Depending on what you're talking about, depending on who you're interacting with, depending on how it's being expressed, the mode, all of those are, yes, going to activate certain choices. But it's also the other way around, because the choices that you're making also affect when you're communicating, when you're speaking. It is a way for us to sort of construe the context. Now, that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump's speech was a challenge to people, because in a way it sort of confused the issue about how does one speak in that context of situation where you have this person who is the US president and they're giving speeches and it doesn't match up to the expectation about how one who is in that role should speak on that occasion. So it confused what is the situation then? Is Trump wrong? Are we seeing the context wrong? What's going on? Why the disconnect? And I'll mention this a bit more later, but really, in many ways, the whole anti-political kind of discourse was something that, in fact, won him a lot of support, truthfully, because people were fed up with politicians. And so here comes someone in politics that doesn't talk like a politician, instead talks like a businessman, doesn't talk like someone real highly educated with very eloquent speaking. No, someone who comes with a real down-to-earth way of speaking that doesn't sound like it's been drafted and written out and prepared beforehand. That was attractive to some people. But do you see that it is important how one's language is understood and how people respond to it depends, yes, on the context, and how one speaks then also makes us sort of come up with what we believe to be that context of situation. And what is formed then is, because you have this connection between speech, the way we speak, and the situation, what that means is that you have a variety, you have a way of speaking appropriate to political discourse, appropriate to academic discourse, appropriate to the language of science. What you end up with is what we've called a register, a variety of language defined according to use, not users, use. By means then of my act of meaning, I participate in an act of interpersonal exchange. I'm interacting with you. I'm communicating my sense of my own identity. I'm communicating who I believe myself to be in my role, my background. All of that is coming through my worldview, my way of seeing not just language, but the world itself, my interpretation of existence. All of that is coming through the way I speak. So then you have this context and semantics, context and meaning, these different strata. But you, at the same time, what is meaning? And this we have, as I have repeatedly said, we have the metafunctions, the ideational, the interpersonal, the textual. Again, these, are there other functions of language? The way we've construed it like this is systemic functional theory. And theory is a way in which we try to categorize what is meaning. And so we come up with these sort of three metafunctions. The first one, how we construe experience, the experiential, but we also added a subcomponent here, the logical. Interpersonal, how we enact our social relationships, how then the meaning itself materializes in the actual text itself. That's meaning. And so Halliday says what? That this is a system that makes meanings. This is meaning. We're making meaning in the sense we're making choices. But then how we make those, how we realize that meaning, how we turn the invisible into the visible, how we take the function of language, the purpose to which we speak, and actually turn it into something you hear and something you see. That is done through the lexicogrammar. What is the lexicogrammar? It is the wording. It is the combination of words, combining words. So what we're saying is, and this has been fundamental to everything that we've been saying so far, and that is that how we have meaning is realized through the wording. So what does that mean? How can we sort of, again, get a handle on what that means to talk about the way in which we reflect on the world? And again, then we come up with what we call the system of transitivity. Process, participant, circumstance. What's the verb? Who's initiating? Who's affected? What are the circumstances? This brings us to another aspect then. If we understand language as a system of choice, how do we describe that system? What are the properties of that system? And one of the properties is that we have sets of semantic options. It is paradigmatic. Because we can say for the process, then, what kind of process? What type of process? How do we distinguish those processes? How do I decide I have material, mental, verbal, behavioral, existential, relational? How do I end up with these 6 categories? Again, what Halliday is saying is, if I'm going to do this and I'm going to make up these categories, it should be based on something that I can really identify with some sense of objectivity, some scientific way to do so. How else except through the grammar? Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. Why thinking grammatically? Because what we're saying is, if you're thinking about meaning, there's no handle on it. It's invisible. And so meaning comes through the wording. So then how do we identify those different categories of choice with respect to the process. We ask these questions. Can you ask, what did X do? Can you ask, what did X do to Y? Can the initiator be human? Must the initiator be human-like, have a sense of consciousness? Can that process project? Can it take a that clause? These questions are posed in a way to be able to distinguish what are the various process types. So it isn't just sort of based on meaning, because as I said to you before, if you're going to distinguish the process types by meaning, when do you stop? How delicate is your distinction? Because every verb then would be different. And some verbs would have multiple senses. It never ends. And so we have to have a way to sort of somehow be able to identify the system. And here the system we're saying is it's paradigmatic. There are categories. The categories, no, we didn't just come up with them ourselves. They're there out of the grammar, because it's how we use these verbs that defines the fact that they are different. It's the fact that I can't say John saw the bird. What did John do? He saw the bird. I can't say that. I can't answer that question like that. What did John do? He saw the bird. No, doesn't make sense. Why? Because I see the verb to see as something different from doing. If I say, what did John do? He watched the bird. Okay, that's doing. I can answer it that way. So I have a distinction. How the distinction is identifiable through the grammar. So we have the process types. Process types distinguished by a series of questions. They're sort of our empirical way of being able to identify the process types. For each of these process types, there's a role. The initiator of a doing process is the actor, the agent. The initiator of a mental process is the sensor. Now, Hassan, as we've seen, grouped these together, the ER roles, the ED roles. Who is the initiator? Who's the affected? You'll remember the illustration I gave you, Donald Jung versus Susan Rice. Why did I give you this illustration? Because I wanted to make it clear that the distinction in terms of who is the initiator of doing processes matters. It does give us an idea. It does tell us how these two people see the world. It does give us insight into their ideology. All right, follow this through. Take this another step. Trump. We looked at two speeches of his, speaking to Congress, speaking at CIA headquarters. Now, the speech to Congress was, well, that was no different than if Obama was giving a speech or Nixon was giving a speech. I'm talking about US presidents here, all right? And typical of what one would expect. In this was sort of his first occasion to sort of show off that he knows how to read a speech that's been written, that is written in such a way that includes those sort of elements that we expect. We expect repetition, things in threes. Okay, that makes it powerful. We expect a logical progression, how the new information at the end of one clause is taken up at the next sentence. So Yeah, it had all the elements here. But then he went and gave a speech at CIA headquarters. Here he's still supposed to be speaking presidentially, but it was nothing like what we saw the speech to Congress. Why? Because here he was making it up as he goes along. He's just speaking. He's just talking. It's like if you meet a friend and you're sitting down, you're talking and you're chatting, and your topics change, and people switch their topics. And so, I mean, we did a thing yesterday. Thing. What's a thing? Okay. Did everybody like the speech? I mean, talking. How did you like it? And then I've been given good reviews. And then he switches the topic. But okay, so this switching topics, so people begin to say, well, he can't think, systematically. He is always changing his topic here. Well, it's true. He then went on to say about how I get up, I turn on, I made this, about the media coverage. And again, he switches it. Then he begins to talk about the rain. So there's no real order to it. It seems to be a sort of disconnected conversation. That's one way, because it's just him speaking. But where he's sort of on one topic, and he switches to another topic, and he switches back. The other thing, though, was who's it about? And so the speech to the CIA, of course, we look at the experiential themes. So what is it when I say experiential theme? What is that? That means it was what was the grammatical subject. It began the clause. I, we, you, those three stand out. Speech to Congress, we is what is primary there, and they and I a bit less. But what did people say about Donald Trump? The frequency with which he references himself. How many times he says, I, me, my. So that one scholar, I mean, they did this study and they looked at 7 of his speeches and they came up to this 3.3% are self-references, in which these researchers said was a remarkably high figure by any typical corpus. Well, then his speech to CIA, that was not 3.3%. First person singular, 14%. First person plural, 7%. Now, what can you say? Yeah, he's talking about himself. So we again here we're still on this transitivity, right? We're still looking at the transitivity. We're still saying who is in the ER role for all these various process types. And what we're saying is I was 24%. This was him speaking to the CIA headquarters. I in the ER role, 24%. A quarter of his speech, he is the what is he doing? Sensing, saying. It's what he thinks. It's what he says. It's not even what he's doing. Do you see my point, though? This isn't just about Trump. What I'm trying to get at is the point is when you want to have an understanding of how language is being used and how it's making meaning, the choices that you make about the process type, who is the initiator, who is the affected, they make a difference. They make a difference in how way we speak is perceived by others. the fact that he uses so many first-person references shocks some people, because in his role in that occasion, you don't. Now, when he gave the speech to Congress, yeah, he switched, and 72% is doing. I accounted only for 5% of the doing, 8% overall. So, and that was considered to be speaking presidentially. So the choices that we make communicate how we perceive the situation. How does he perceive the situation when he speaks to Congress? Oh, that was different than when he gives a lot of other speeches. His other speeches, if you look at Trump, he's like the anti-president, all right? He does everything that was not what was expected. He's the alternative. It's contrary to all the expectations. Do you think that was because he doesn't know better? No. It's a choice, and it's a choice that he's making. And by that choice, he's saying something. All right. Transitivity. I hope we've made a strong case that's you do have to look at the process and who's the initiator, who's the affected. Those, that does matter. What else matters? Logical. Well, it's about 7:46. I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break here. Let's take about 10 minutes break, and rather than start this and then continue it on. Okay, so let's take a break. And you may be wondering, am I going to mention the Pookie text? Well, yes, I will. All right, that's yet to come. All right, so let's take a break for now. Okay, 10 minutes. It's about 7:47, so nearly around 8 we'll come back. Okay. Okay. Logical. Are there dependent clauses? How are the clauses combined? Again, I hope we've made the case why this is indeed necessary. And again, I'm going to come back to Trump. Remember, because of the way Trump speaks, there were some that suggested that he can't do hypotaxis. He can. It's there in the speech to Congress. Now, of course, the point you might say is I mean, that's a written out speech. That's, but yes, that's the way speeches are delivered by people in that particular role. Whether it was Nixon, whether it was Obama, whether it was Trump, doesn't matter. There is a team of speechwriters that are drafting those speeches. And they all sort of have a similar sort of, if we measure parataxes against hypotaxes, it's obviously it's going to be more hypotactic, because hypotactic it's more developed. The ideas are progressing. When we looked at Nixon, and we've looked at his various of his speeches, when he got elected the second time, given his second inaugural, 28 to 72%. When he gave his resignation speech on TV, a speech that he gave, 31 to 69%. And then, though, where that really diverged, where it really became more like what you see in Trump's speech. In fact, 63% parataxis, 37% hypotaxis. What made the difference? He wasn't speaking to a text. The ideas were just what was coming as he was speaking spontaneously. In that speech that he gave before the White House staff and those people that were working for him, it was an emotional speech because it wasn't prepared beforehand. Now, Obama, likewise, again, we notice that it really makes a difference. Because for Obama as well, if you compare Trump's, this is the point where you can't say, well, he doesn't know hypotaxis. That's nonsense, okay? It's this almost where it gets to be almost nearly half-half, parataxis, hypotaxis, that you can see people respond, though, differently. The speech to the CIA headquarters, yes, we've talked about how people responded to Trump's speech there. And Obama's inaugural, the first inaugural, that was, again, almost a 50-50 split, where again, people responded to it saying that it lacked eloquence. So it was a deciding factor in how people responded. That is meaning. How people respond, that is meaning. And you remember what this New York Times literary critic, he's not a linguist, he's a literary critic, Stanley Fish, what he said, it was surely more paratactic than hypotactic. Well, it was like 50-50. That gave that impression. And it wasn't developing an argument. It was like it were as though the speech were in discrete moments. And in fact, analyzing that speech, we could see that it truly was. That you would have blocks of text. And you see how I've shown the architecture here to be at the top, where it all is rather, you had the paragraphs 6 through 9, then paragraphs 10 through 18, then paragraphs 19 through 26. And they're all arranged rather not hypotactic at all, paratactic. It's all in a sequence that, and what was driving it was that each of these blocks exhibited a certain patterning, a certain texture, a certain formula that made that speech come across as it did, as highly paratactic, very diffuse, not developed. We saw that the formulas, some of them were actually derived from past presidential inaugural speeches, and that was deliberate. The speechwriters, that was what they intended to do. They wanted to draw on these speeches from past presidents, adopting their formulas, adopting the way they use the language in a way to make that speech have the character, the history. It didn't work, but that was the aim. And again, each of these blocks had their own particular patterning. It is precisely the spirit, this use of cleft sentences or predicated themes, as we call them. This is another block. Each of these blocks, identifiable by, distinguishable in terms of a pattern, a grammatical, a lexico-grammatical pattern that gave an identity to each of these blocks. But the fact that's why the speech came across as it did, as though it were in discrete moments. Flat. That was the only way to describe that speech. Flat and diffuse. You've looked at transitivity, experiential. We've looked at the logical. parataxis, hypotaxis, the textual. Theme, information, the flow of information, old information that's been already mentioned, new information that's being introduced for the first time, how that relates then to the choices that are made at the beginning of each of these clauses. When we say what is theme, it's not to say that these answers are mutually exclusive. No. What is theme? It is indeed the starting departure point of the message. It's how that clause begins. You'll notice that both Halliday and Hassan almost use interchangeably message and clause. The clause is a message. It's what the speaker wants to talk about. It orients the clause within the context. It fits this clause with what's been said before. And it relates to overall how the text is being developed. What is theme? The initial grammatical element. Focus. It's the new information, signaled in English, usually by a specific intonation pattern, tonic prominence, giving a special sort of peak in terms of intonation, rise and fall. It can be the grammatical subject. By default, the unmarked theme is the grammatical subject, but you can put the circumstance there, yesterday. You can put the complement there. It can include an embedded clause, people who live in glass houses. Now, does it matter? Yes. Remember the Obama-Romney debates? Now, we looked at Obama speaking. We looked at Romney's also. The point that we were making was that people responded in these debates positively or negatively. The response is meaning. I'll never forget when I was studying for doing my postgraduate study at SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo in linguistics. There was a famous professor there. He was from the Prague School. He was Czech. His name was Paul Garvin. And he really was well known in not systemic function. He was a functional linguist. That's the influence of the Prague School, all right? In fact, the Prague School had a big influence on Halliday's approach to how he works with language. So this Prague School linguist, Paul Garvin, one of the points that he made was, how do you know what is meaning? You know the meaning from the response. It is how one responds that you know what was the meaning that was intended. It was because it is a judgment. How do you decide what is meaning? You cannot crawl into the mind of the speaker or the writer. And if you say it's the intention, well, yes, it's the intention, but how do you know what that meaning is except in the actual response that takes place once that message is stated and communicated? So I've always been interested in the responses. And in this way, I'd ask, for example, in the first presidential debate, we saw that Romney won, we said. Obama didn't do very well. It was judged to be poor performance. So it begs the question, what was so poor about it? And can we answer that question? Yes, I believe we can. We can then also likewise say why Obama did so much better in the third presidential debate. And one of the reasons, not saying that's the main reason, I'm saying it's one of the reasons, the choice of theme, what he put first. Because it was saying to his audience, it's what I want to talk about. And at this point, people were asking, why should we vote for you? Why should we elect you? And he's, in the first debate, going all over the place with what he's talking about. It was so, again, so diffuse, so spread out. It didn't have a focus. But in the third debate, it did. We. It also had an interpersonal meaning in the sense that here was the focus was, yes, me speaking to you, we. And that really did seem to have an impact. And it was noticeable, the difference. It was so noticeable that it was clearly deliberate. And so we go from, for example, 67 in Obama's first debate, all right, 67% of theme choices were other things. 23%. The you, remember, we sort of discarded it because it was just basically a discourse marker, and never mentioned we. But then notice what happened in the third debate. 35% I, 32% we, 23% other. He got his focus, and he gave that focus to his audience, and his audience could connect. Now, when we talked about theme, we've said that it's not just, okay, the first grammatical element that you put there in the clause. It can have special meanings. There are special constructions that can mean, like it's basically there at the beginning, but it's new. It's not what you were thinking. Or identification. What I need is a new car. Here I'm telling you this and this alone, exclusively this. They have special meanings. It is a choice of theme for this message, the choice of theme for the next message, and the choice of theme for the next message. That progression of choices, whether it's the new information at the end of one clause becomes the theme of the next clause, linear, or you keep repeating the same thing, or things that are related, derived. So we looked at examples of thematic progression, like in this contrast, this comparison of two dictionaries. We looked at in Malala's speech very noticeably how the speech itself divides between the first half, about I, the second half, we, so clearly. And again, when it's so clear like that, the patterning is so obvious, it's so deliberate. These are choices. They are giving you a sense of the way the text is put together, the method of development of the text. Remember Halliday's discussion of Darwin's Origin of Species? One point I want to make, and that is that some might ask, well, when we analyze a text, do we have to analyze everything about it to get at its meaning? In this example that Halliday's illustrating, use of theme in Darwin's Origin of Species, and Halliday is very clear. There's obviously more going on. But he found theme the choice of what was made theme and the choice of what was new to be significant, a significant factor, something that clearly was distinguishable, made this scientific treatise, in Halliday's perception, so powerful. So that the choices of theme culminate. Remember, this is Halliday's description of it. These motifs culminate in a resounding lexicogrammatical cadence that brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book. You can feel the momentum, right? To a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. You can sense the excitement, right? What was so exciting? It was the way in which all of these ideas that had been there and being developed throughout this, especially these last two paragraphs of The Origin of Species, they all now come together. All are reworked and placed in the last final sentence. It's true. All those sort of threads came to a crashing conclusion. That it did say something. It was like a momentum. It was like all of these ideas that had that were gradually being developed throughout the text now come to this, culminate in this final sentence where all of the elements are there. Remember, I come back to Nixon's second inaugural. Again, we mentioned previously about the parataxis and hypotaxis. But do you remember when we looked at that speech, again, how theme plays a role in sort of laying out the structure of the text, the rhetorical structure of the text. In this case, when we talk about theme and thematic progression, it almost is not just between clauses anymore, right? In this case, it was between paragraph 3, the ending, peace in the world, and then what will follow in paragraphs 4 through 11, elaborating on, and then beginning with the peace we seek in the world. That carryover, that connection. Use of but in theme, the textual theme. But let us clearly understand, when he signals in paragraph 5, it's concession, it's a kind of enhancement. We shall respect, we shall. Well, we've seen this, remember Hu Jintao's speech when he gave the state visit and when he spoke, and remember how there were certain phrasings that were repeated, not unlike what we see here. A continuous thematic progression. Again, signaling a kind of parataxis, a sequencing, an extension of ideas, all related to this idea of what we shall do. So the method of development of the text is importantly, significantly signaled through the use of theme. There's another element of this speech, and remember I sort of took that rhetorical structure theory mapping, and instead of looking at it from one end, I sort of turned it upside down so that we saw how the text more or less built up, because it's a metaphor. What we're saying with this mapping is that it's the architecture of the text, and how we sort of can see that building 3 through 11 sort of was building up a particular idea, which then changed and was another idea was introduced. But you can see it building, developing up to an idea. That was paragraphs 3 through 11. But then we noticed something else happening. There was a pattern of what was not said. Remember we said at the beginning, we said that it's not just the choices that you make, it's the choices that you don't make. And that decision, or whatever was the reason for why paragraphs 3 through 11 did not continue the same pattern that was there throughout the rest of the text. I mean, it's not poetry, all right? So it's not, you know, foregrounding. I don't think so. Some cases, as I've said to you before, I believe that more or less signals where some part was added to a text that was already written before. And then when the added portion was put in there, this paragraphs 3 through 11, it had a different texture. It looked like a different cut of cloth that was sewn into the rest of the text. How do we decide that? How do we see that? We see it through the patterning that emerges. That patterning gives us a sense of the texture, and that texture gives us a sense of the various parts that together come together to make up the text as a whole. The texture defines the functionally significant spans of text that are thus related one to the other and create the architecture. So logical is not just between two clauses. It's also extends beyond the clause to the text as a whole. There is a logical structuring. Parataxis is not just between two clauses, but can be between two functionally significant spans of text that have their identity by virtue of their texture. Logical. As we talked about it, dependent clauses. How are the clauses combined? Parataxis, hypotaxis. Terms that by now should just be so commonplace to you. And the point is, you can see that they are even terms that are used when people that aren't linguists are talking about people's writing or speaking. That literary critic Stanley Fish commenting about Obama's highly paratactic speech. The comments about Trump, that he doesn't know how to use hypotaxis. These are, you see, even in almost sort of a popular discourse, these notions are there. We've made a distinction between clauses that are additional information, elaborating, like hypotaxis, as opposed to restrictive relative clause, which are embedded, which we called rank shifting. And again, I think these terms are terms that you're familiar with. We've looked at them in text, we've analyzed text, we've discovered them, we've identified them. We've talked about how parataxis and hypotaxis, yes, describe sort of a balance, but nonetheless, the relationship is also one in which you could say is elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting. Whereas rhetorical structure theory defines a set of relations with much greater detail than Halliday does here. These general categories, these are more general, elaborating, extending, enhancing, projecting. They are not so well defined as in rhetorical structure theory. But nonetheless, we can see what's being accomplished. So when we looked at this closing sentence from Obama's victory speech, we saw again that the choices of logical structuring, this is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids. That B, 84B and 84C, and paratactic, two things. To restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, same pattern. To reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth, same pattern. And then he goes on to start a new within that 84G through O, that out of many we are one. That while we breathe, we hope. It's so interesting that the way this is put together. So you have, as we said, you have almost 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It gave it a beat. It gave it a rhythm. Interpersonal. Now, interpersonal meaning, again here, it's probably the least explored, least investigated area metafunction within SFL. It's an area where too little work has been done. And because it is a difficult area. Now, Halliday does identify two sort of aspects of interpersonal meaning, but it obviously doesn't take in all right, of what we would regard as interpersonal meaning. It certainly is the clauses exchange, defining the role. Are you the giver or are you the receiver? You giving information. And yes, the choice of subject, grammatical subject, followed by the finite verb, indicates it's a statement, giving information. Switching them around, the finite verb followed by the grammatical subject, yes, indicates it's a question. Removing the grammatical subject and the finite verb, you end up with a command or a request. So yeah, it's interesting to notice that how we identify the role in terms of what we're actually doing with language and relating to others is defined by these two elements, the subject and the finite in English. The other is how we indicate attitude. There is an area of systemic functional linguistics called appraisal theory. I don't teach appraisal theory. The reason I don't is because I find it way too subjective. So that someone who uses appraisal theory, now this is a criticism, and it's based on my experience with observing people using it, in the sense that you have one who analyzes using appraisal theory, and then someone else comes along and does an analysis also with appraisal theory and comes up with something completely different. Now, that, I feel, then it lacks something that gives it a grounding. That was one of the complaints. I also spoke with Halliday about this. One of the points that he made was that it's not sufficiently grounded in the grammar so that we can make a statement that we can remember what he has said before, that it isn't anecdotal. It isn't a do-it-yourself kit of private commentary. It is something that you can indeed compare. And you can compare across analyses by different analysts. That is something I think significant. What is the attitude of the speaker? Well, modality is an obvious aspect of it that one can indeed observe. And we did when we looked at Obama's, one of Obama's speeches, and the use of should, the use of will, they do give a sense of whether one is indicating obligation or one is indicating confidence. That comes through. Now, Nixon's resignation speech, the speech that he gave the night before he gave that departure speech, we looked at the use of modality here. It was so interesting to observe because the speech itself was sort of identifiable into its various parts. Again, its functionally significant spans by a patterning in the use of modality. So that the up through to the point where he says, I shall resign, it's sort of not yet real. It's hypothetical. It's what may or might be or would be. But then when he says, I shall resign, it shifts. And then it becomes definite. Will. It's lost completely this sort of hypothetical nature to it. It's done. It's a done deal. When we get another sort of, I shall leave this office with regret. In other words, he sort of marks off the speech by, I shall resign. I shall leave this office. And so each of them has sort of, again, a particular character identifiable by the modality, as we can see, but also something else. That was very interesting in the sense that this one block was one where it was all about we, us, and our, and there was nothing first person about it at all. And again, I don't know if you won't remember, I'm sure, but during this part, he actually smiles. It's almost as though he were back as president, as though it's like no longer talking about resigning. It's about his accomplishments. It's about what he's done as president. It's the positive. And it's so marked. It's so obvious in terms of it begins another I shall. And in this, then, it becomes about we and us and our. Before he comes up to another shall when he gets to the conclusion, and there it's back to first person. Modality, the use of modal auxiliaries, such a definable texture, leaving clear indication of the architecture of this text. There's another thing interesting about theme, and that was that a lot of the themes are not the grammatical subject. In fact, much of the themes were related to circumstances. Quite remarkably. And I can only assume the reason being that he is trying to frame his resignation within the special circumstances that made it necessary. What is a functionally significant span? We're talking about text here. Text made up of parts. What defines a functionally significant span? It could be a clause, it could be a group of clauses, could be a paragraph, could be a section. I mean, we have different words for these, but what we're saying is that a text divides into parts hierarchically. At the very bottom, all the parts are clauses. At the top, it's the text as a whole. In between, you have a whole hierarchical organization. Groups of clauses together form higher and higher, larger sizes of functionally significant spans. So what defines then a span is its texture, is its cohesiveness. So I've been using the word texture. It's the sense of cohesiveness. It's a pattern. That patterning gives it a sense. A pattern is a repetition. The repetition is what gives it cohesiveness. So what's the difference between cohesiveness and coherence? The architecture is built up of those functionally significant spans, each with its own texture. But how they are then related is its coherence. When we talk about coherence, I hope this is clear. Cohesiveness is the patterning that gives a special identity to an extended amount of text. I use the term functionally significant span, comes from rhetorical structure theory. Coherence are the relations between those spans. What helps us deal with coherence? Rhetorical structure theory. When we're talking about cohesiveness, we're talking about a patterning of choices at the level of the message, at the level of the clause. Those choices, lexicogrammatical choices. The clause is the most basic lexicogrammatical unit. We look at theme, we look at mood, we look at modality, we look at theme, transitivity, parataxis, hypotaxis, relations between clauses at the level of the clause. Because the clause is a lexicogrammatical unit. That's where the wording realizes the meaning. But what happens with a text is you begin to add up these messages. The messages begin to reveal a pattern, begin to reveal parts that make up the text. And how those parts then are related defines its coherence. When we talk about then rhetorical structure theory, why was it necessary? Why is it necessary to go beyond the grammar? This is a course on text linguistics. So if I'm going to deal with a text, I have to go beyond just the clauses themselves, the messages that make up the text. You see, I can't just say, here's the text as a whole, and here are all the pieces of the puzzle. You take a sort of these, and I've used this metaphor before, these large picture puzzles, right? And they come with 1,000 pieces, maybe more. And when they're all put together, all those pieces of the puzzle, that you have a beautiful picture. Likewise with a text. All the pieces are the clauses, the messages. Together they form the text as a whole. Excuse me. Now, when you put together one of these big puzzles, you do so how? You identify pieces that sort of look alike, don't you? So if it's a landscape, and I know I've said this to you before, so pardon me for repeating it, but I think that it makes sense to me And when you think about a puzzle, you have the landscape, you have the green, and you have the blue sky. You're going to divide up your pieces then into at least those two parts, all right? And then you may see some cottage or house there, and you see those pieces that make up that part. And maybe there's a river, you see the pieces that make up that part. And you put those sort of, you assemble each of these parts together, but then you put all the parts together to make up the picture. Rarely do you go piece by piece, right? But that's how we see a text. See a text in terms of a text consists of these functionally significant text spans, that blue sky, that river, that little cottage. Okay? Now, all of them belong in this picture. All right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a picture. And the same with the text. All of the parts, they all contribute to the intended meaning of the writer. What's the writer want to accomplish? What's the writer want to say? And you have smaller into larger, and they're all sort of related to each other. So what are the relations that when we talk about a text, how do we see these parts then as related? Now, some of these parts in a text, some clauses, some parts are more core, more significant than other parts, which are more maybe just elaborating. I illustrated it, remember, with this email from when Obama was running for president. The point was, okay, motivation. Now, motivation that's a relation. How is it defined? Well, motivation is that you want someone to do something. Grammatically, yes, it is also pretty obvious here. How? Because you have 21 is an imperative. What it's telling someone to do something. So what's the rest of it beforehand is to motivate them to do something. So to motivate, you have to be telling somebody to do something. To show, in English, we have the to infinitive. It expresses purpose. But can mean concession. And the point that I was making here was that but is not just between 20 and 19, it's between 20 and 16 through 19, that whole block. If, now the if is here is between, if Senator Clinton wants, it's between 20A, B, wants to continue this, C, and D, let's show that we're ready. You see the point? We have lexicogrammatical clues that tell us, but the relations themselves are all defined semantically, because the text is a semantic unit. It is something that we are interpreting. The same was as we continue through this, all right? And I won't go through all of the parts here. I want to come to this one because it makes this point. And this was the same email. And I hope you maybe remember it, all right? We had 3 sentences. And each of these sentences sort of had the same sort of pattern. We can either do this or we can do this. And one of the weekends is what we can do with Obama. The other is with Clinton. One of them is positive, one of them is negative. All right, so let's just take 23A and 23B here. We can either take on John McCain with a candidate who's already united Republicans, independents against us. Or We can do it with a campaign that's united Americans from all parties around a common purpose. So you have, on the one hand, united Republicans and independents against us, or united people around a common purpose. The one is a divider, the one is a unifier. The patterning was the same for all three sentences. We can, or we can, we can, or we can. And it sort of divided in the sense that we had each of these break down into two halves. Now, grammatically, now this is my point. It's an important point I want to make. So please listen closely. Or is suggest paratactic. Grammatically, lexicogrammatically, it's paratactic. It should be drawn like this. And if I were just dealing with the grammar, the lexicogrammar, this is how I would map it. But when I'm doing a rhetorical structure analysis, because the rhetorical structure analysis is the analysis at the level of the text is a semantic unit. And the rhetorical structure theory is semantic in nature. So it looks at what is the meaning between these two parts. Is it a contrast? Yes. But there's another aspect to it. It is antithesis or antithesis, however you want to say it, where the writer has positive regard for the situation presented in the nucleus. And the nucleus and the satellite are in contrast. I've never seen a better illustration of this fact. A and B, and the three sentences, similar way, all right? There are two choices that are made. They are in contrast. But clearly, one is for Obama, one is positive, one is for Clinton, it is negative. Clearly, the writer is asking for people to donate for Obama. So clearly, one of these alternatives is what is favored. The writer has positive regard. So we consider it to be the nucleus. So instead of looking at it like this, the second part was the positive one. We can do it with a campaign that's united, 24, or we can do it with a campaign that hasn't taken a dime of their money because we've been funded by you. Or we can nominate someone who opposed the war in Iraq from the beginning. All three, it's the latter part, the latter half, that's the positive one, that's for Obama. And so following from rhetorical structure theory, this relation is defined how? Completely semantically, completely by its meaning. And so what we end up with is mapping it in such a way that we can see what it means. So yes, the grammar does give us some idea. It does tell us that we have alternatives. But when we get to dealing with a text, what rhetorical structure theory is saying is that the text, like Halliday says, is a semantic unit and needs to be dealt with semantically. The definitions then, therefore, of the relations between the parts that make up the text are defined in terms of their meaning. Well, we've come to 10 to 9, and it's time for a break. All right, let's take our break now, and then we'll come back to finish up. All right, so let's take a break.
Prof. Webster. Hi. Hello.
Okay. Now, one of your classmates let me know that it seemed to be stuck on this, and subsequent slides you weren't able to see. So let me just carry on. And what I'd like to do is I guess you could hear me talking about this example, but you couldn't see what was on the text. And by the way, Shen Ming Ming, I see you. You did ask me if I could hear you.
Yes.
Was there something you wanted to say?
Yes. I think I may leave my question at the end of the class because my
For some reason, I'm not hearing you. Let me see. I should be able to. I'm plugged in, but
it's I
okay. Could you try again?
yes. How about
Okay,
now?
now, yes, okay.
Yes. I think I can leave my question at the end of the class and we will move on now because
Okay, all
it
right.
may take
So,
quite a few minutes. Yes.
okay, sorry about that. All right.
Nice. Okay.
So let's hold on a second. I will try to go through this rather quickly because I do want to get to some other things, and I did cover this in speaking, but I'm sorry, I don't know why it wouldn't have been carrying on. All right. In any case, what my point about looking at this when we talk about rhetorical structure theory, and we're looking at how we map out the what is the structure of the text, the architecture of the text. What I've been saying to you is that there are lots of clues that tell you that, for example, motivation. There should be an imperative because there should be something you're telling someone to do something. All right, and you're giving them the motivation to do it. If you see a to infinitive, it indicates purpose. If you see a but, it may indicate concession. If will be condition. So the point being, we use where there are devices, lexicogrammatical devices that tell us how these relations are put together. Now we can go through the rest of this and it's the same. We can have by failing would be means. Again, to show is purpose. All right, so all of these, we can make that point. But the point I really do want to make, and it's an important one, and that is that when we are mapping out, what we are mapping out is the semantic, the text as a semantic unit, as a unit of meaning. And so when, in this example, which I was saying we have the three sentences, and we've looked at this before, so I think I can go through that quickly. We said we have the three sentences, and if we were to use just the lexicogrammatical clue here, the conjunction or, we'd say that, okay, we have alternatives. It's paratactic. It's extension. That would be lexicogrammatically, yes. But does that give us the meaning of the text? Because the meaning of the text is that these alternatives that we have, 23A versus 23B, one of them is in favor of Obama, one of them is against Clinton. And so the alternatives, one is the writer has positive regard for. So that is the whole point of antithesis, that the writer has positive regard for the nucleus. What defines the nucleus? It's what the writer has positive regard for. So even though lexicogrammatically we have or, we have a thematic progression, we can, or we can. They are so symmetrical, but in meaning, they are not. In meaning wise, one is favored over the other. And what rhetorical structure theory is attempting to do is to map out the interpretation. And that interpretation sometimes may be made clear by the grammar, and other times it may not coincide with the grammar. And yes, in that sense, you are making an interpretation. You are interpreting the meaning of the text. But that is the point of rhetorical structure theory. The point is you are mapping out the architecture, what that text means, the text as a semantic unit. All right, come back to this point. Why do we value certain texts as art? This has been an important element of the course. Halliday is saying we need to explain the value that a text has. I need to be able to explain the value of why, for example, Obama was favored over Romney in the third debate. I need to be able to explain why Trump was regarded rather negatively by some in terms of the way he spoke. He was not presidential. Why? We need to be explained the value that a text has. Texts carry value, but we also want to explain what makes a text art. How do we explain what and how do we explain then what makes art art? Halliday is saying that we can apply the same approach. Doesn't matter what's the nature of the text, whether it's Darwin's Origin of Species or whether it be a popular scientific magazine, Scientific American, or whether it be a children's story, Mother Goose, the same approach, the same methodology that will enable us to be able to explain the similarities, the differences, their aesthetic value, how they are valued, their functional value. Did they meet their purpose? Now that's the whole gist of what is being talked about here, and that is, do we have a means available to be able to do this? Not just to say the text means this, but to explain how it is even valued. Valued aesthetically. Is it art? Valued in terms of its function. Did it live up to its purpose? Did it achieve what the writer, what the speaker wanted to? So what is then this theory that will enable us to do this? Halliday calls it grammatiques. Halliday's idea is that we can look at the grammar. And thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically, yes. But by thinking grammatically, how can we tell what a text means? How much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? How a text comes to be valued? So for this, we turn to Rukai Asan and looked at her approach for how she was saying we can go beyond the first level of meaning to another level of meaning. And that is what is art. Art is being able to achieve a second order of meaning, a deeper meaning, a symbol, a metaphor, the text as a whole. And how that is achieved is through foregrounding. What is foregrounding? Foregrounding requires there must be a background. And how is that background achieved? By just taking the way that we use language and creating patterns and then repatterning in order to foreground and be able to achieve that, communicate that message, that hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Now, Halliday says that all of this is a kind of de-automatization. What we are doing is the poet is artistically creating an automatization against which to de-automatize, creating a background against which to foreground. Metaphorical meaning. is created through a patterning, creating the background, the automatic. What David Butt describes as mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. And then, you see, up until now, all our talk has been about looking for the patterns that identify the texture, and on the basis of that, identify the functionally significant spans that somehow cohere together to create the architecture. That's so far, the last 2 hours, that's what we've been talking about. But now we're saying that there's another level of meaning. There's a repatterning, a foregrounding, a de-automatization. And this extends across the text. The whole text is, in a way, being used as a way to convey a particular message. It is an extended metaphor. The metaphor extends through the text, across the whole text. It is a kind of de-automatization. You see, the whole point is the key to innovation, whether it's verbal science, whether it's looking at how grammatical metaphor is used, creativity in verbal art. It is, in both cases, the ability to, on the one hand, in the case of grammatical metaphor, recognize. In the case of verbal art, to create the automatic, and then to de-automatize. The key to innovation in verbal science is the ability to recognize the automatic and to de-automatize against it. In the case of verbal science, it is in order to be able to innovate, to make the world stand still so you can measure it and describe it. In the case of verbal art, it is to create an automatic throughout a text. The text almost artificially creating a pattern that extends across the text, which then is foregrounded against. And the whole process is a kind of de-automatization. But whether it's verbal science to innovate or verbal art to create, it is the same thing. Now, the whole point of art is that it's deliberate. How can you tell that it's deliberate? The contrast, there's a consistency. And Hassan gave the illustration, the widower in the country. It looks, and I won't go through, I won't read it. I don't have the time today to read it. The point being that this is that the routine, mundane, boring life of this poor widower who lives in the country all by himself. And so it's all largely about doing, and it's the widower who's doing. That's the background. That's the automatic. But then there's aspects that are foregrounded. Any other participant engaged in doing is a kind of foregrounding. Most of it is, and he did this, and he did this, and then he did this. That's simple parataxis. But then wherever there isn't simple parataxis, maybe it's parataxis and hypotaxis and rank shifting, all in the same sentence. That's contrast. That's foregrounding. Mainly future tense. Wherever there's another tense, that's de-automatization. That's foregrounding. The widower is the theme. That's the automatic. He is the doer. But then anything else's theme would be in contrast to that, would be foregrounded. And so you look at where does all of that, where do all of those contrasts come together? And they come together at certain points in the text that draw out the aching, draw out the darkness, draw out the screaming. The poem itself, there's a consistency of choice. And that's why I encouraged you, when you did the assignment, you did the Pookie text, you didn't just look for the patterns. You looked for where there was some contrast. You looked for where there was sort of a direction that the poet was taking you. Because where the poet is taking you is to his or her hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. So we looked at a spoken word performance, Brandon Leake. I've talked about the puff text. And what we noticed was his use of basically a simple logical structure at the beginning, his use of rhyme. But then there was that change, and that was where his talking now about his sister having died, and it shifted from active voice. He's no longer the initiator, he is the affected. And the simplicity of what was taking place before is replaced by the complexity. The poem seems to begin and end with much the same patterning. It's what takes place in the middle. There's rhyme at the beginning, there's rhyme at the end. There's mention of 6 feet at the beginning and at the end. There's a whole repetition of to hold on to love loosely so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. But, and where the contrast comes is in 13. It becomes way more complex. It becomes way faster. It involves the no rhyme. So the contrast was clear. It draws your attention to the pain that he felt. And so in a way, the whole poem is constructed in a way that the patterning contributes to this idea. How you're beginning is how you're ending. You're coming full circle, but in so doing, it's to a different outlook. You've changed. The Pookie text.
And he's got everything. America, just sit quietly, listen, take it in.
When I'm up here on stage, they call me Brandon. When I'm with my homies, they call me B, and when I'm with the ladies, let's just say, they call me Taken because I'm already happily spoken for. But when I'm back at home, my mama, she called me Pookie. And though I'm not afraid to admit it, my mother calls me Pookie at like the most inopportune moments. For instance, today, on my way here to America's Got Talent, my mom screamed out the front door, "Make sure that you call me when you get there." Pookie. And like, I get why my mother says it out of courtesy, but to be real, I don't understand why my mom's so concerned with my safety, praying for me as I leave the house on a daily, because I'm just a young man who has faith in Jesus. The same way that stars have faith that space will protect them from this galactic bully we call gravity, who longs to turn their stardust splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its depth. So yes, I never really understood the issue. And then I went on Facebook, and I realized that my mama loved me the same way every mother loved their son, fearfully. Because normally, death don't really bother me. I mean, I'm from Southside Stockton. I'm all too familiar with how some family reunions only ever take place on graveyard grass, and how a hole can be a safe haven for a soul in this mortal game of hide and go seek. But there is something so different about Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and the countless others. And as I stared at that screen, I couldn't help but think I was looking at a mirror image of myself being choked out for merely existing, or for daring to be more than 3/5 of what them folk thought them to be. Or maybe it was simply due to their hue, and in that moment I better understood my black mother's greatest fear was every time I leave her home, on the other side of my phone will no longer be her son, will be America's next most popular hashtag, accompanied by a video of her young star being gunned down by gravity as my stardust has turned splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of my death. So yes, my mother's greatest fear is that I won't return home breathing, blood pulsing through these veins enough to still be her Pookie. And my mama warned me, son, don't you dare get caught at the wrong place at the wrong time with that wrong colored skin, because those 3 strikes, they lead to pine box convictions, and I need you to return home my Pookie again. So dear mom, I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to make it back home to you. But if I don't, just know you was the very last thing on my mind. And I will always, always be your Pookie.
All right. Now, I'm going through your comments and your commentaries and so forth, and there are things that you see that I didn't see, and perhaps there's some things that I see that you didn't see. So let me just go through some of the things I noticed. And one of the first things I noticed was the beginning, where there was this repetition of the when I'm with my homies, when I'm with the ladies, when I'm back. That was so clearly, I mean, a pattern that emerged. So it identified that at least these first 4 sentences together, right? And so looking at the logical structure, I mean, the same thing I can see that I could see when I compared it and looked at the text. I see the same pattern emerging. Now, while I was looking at the logical structure, I wanted to just take a look and see. I could tell there was a lot more hypotaxis. We can see that much more extensive than 72% to 28%. Yeah, it develops across the text. But I was struck by what? Where there was no parataxis, no hypotaxis. And I noticed it in sentences 11, 13, and 16. They stand out. And so I just take a look at those in the text, and I go back to the text and I say, so yes, I never really understood the issue. Normally death don't really bother me. There's something so different. Then he reads the list of names of those that have recently been died.
Death don't really bother me, but something.
Hello? Hello?
Sorry. I forgot me.
Oh, okay. I just thought that's why maybe sometimes I should take this out. In any case, let me continue. All right. So I have these 3 sentences, and one of them lists the names of those who were killed. But there was something I noticed about that particular sentence 16. It was the existential. It only occurs here and is carried on with the idea in 17 for merely existing. That use of the existential, what there is, and that comes through as sort of, it's rather impersonal. All right, this is what exists. So this using the existential here in 16 then leads into what we notice in 17 and 18, where it becomes so complex, so much embedding, so marked in comparison to what we've seen in terms of the simplicity, and so marked in contrast to the simple sentence of 16 and this use of the existential, which carries on into 17. There are repetitions of certain patterns. We have that splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its death, and repeated then later, the splendid spectacle, again, repeated the same line. But what I notice also is that it coincides with something else, and that is this the use of the conjunction so, and then an interpersonal theme. And so we have this, a splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in all of its stuff. So yes. Again, it's repeated in 18, and then again, followed immediately by so yes. And then finally, the last 20, so dear mom. Those three, each of them with so, and then followed by an interpersonal theme before going on to mention the subject. We begin to sort of have a sense of the way the text is sort of being constructed. Because that first, so yes, I never really understood the issue. It draws my attention to what some of you have noticed also, and that is the understanding. It's about understanding. I never really understood, but then by the time you get to 18, I better understood. And then 18 concludes again with that splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of my death. So I've come from the beginning, so yes, and I end with splendid spectacle, and it carries on to another so yes. But in the meantime, I never understood. Now I better understood. Understanding has changed. He's gone from not understanding to understanding. But what else is repeated here? Fearfully. My mother, black mother's greatest fear. My mother's greatest fear. Fear. That's what he understood. He understood her fear. So what we come to is sort of this, what to me strikes me as, I mean, we have the pairing of things, all right? We have the splendid spectacle repeated. We have the first sort of dialogue with his mom saying, we have that first sort of direct speech. Make sure that you call me. And at the end, son, don't you dare get caught up. Again, a pair of direct speech where she is speaking to him. But what strikes me is in 16, 17, 18, it's that part where what he understands. Now, I said the existential, it seems sort of merely existing. It's so impersonal. What does that contrast with? It contrasts with the mother's love, the emotion. You see, these people that have just become a splendid spectacle, they become something that there is no emotion. They become something to look at. They become that hashtag. But what's special is the love that he has. And these people also had those who loved them. So we notice that there is in 16, 17, 18, again, 17 and 18 are marked with that what is going to then contribute to that rich lexical density. When I looked at the transitivity, I was trying to see what was noticeable. Well, yeah, of course you had that call, calls in 6. The point was then when I looked at the first person singular, material process, where he is in the ED role, it's always how he's called. And his mother is calling him. That repetition of call. He's called. He has a name. He has somebody who's calling him. Someone who's paying attention to him. And then the process that is repeated where he is in the ER role is the mental process. He is the one who is understanding. He's getting it. You see, what I see in this spoken word performance is about him achieving an understanding. What is he understanding? He's understanding his Black mother's fear for her son. And her son has a name. He has a name by which he is called. The contrast with this personal, he's called by name, he's so loved. The impersonal, the merely existing, a splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of his death. The impersonal. So what he's saying, how those names, the list of names of people that it was something that seemed so distant. It just was what existed. But then it became very real to him. The reality sunk in. The reality was something that he finally realized. He finally understood. He knew. That's how I read it. That's what I see in the text itself. Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, countless others, they also had a name. They also were loved. They aren't just a splendid spectacle. They aren't just a hashtag. They aren't just existing, not just merely existing. They were loved. We also looked at, moving on, we also looked at the commencement addresses of Steve Jobs, David Foster Wallace, the anti-text. I have found so interesting in looking at David Foster Wallace's, because the whole point of what we've been trying to get at is this idea of de-automatization, and what the whole text itself, the whole speech, comes across as just a counter reality. It's set up in opposition to some established norm. The whole point that, what I started off by saying was that a text occurs in context, and how we perceive the text depends on the context, and how we perceive the context is very much dependent on the text. But then you have these, like David Foster Wallace, who go against the grain, who go against what is the established norm, what a commencement speech is supposed to be like. Donald Trump, who goes against completely what a politician is supposed to sound like. You see, the meaning is not just in the choices that you make, it's in the choices you don't make. And it's in the choices that you make that sometimes are completely in contrast to what is the expected norm. You see, the reason I put David Foster Wallace and Brandon Leake together was because both of them surprisingly achieved what can only be regarded as great value, highly valued. Brandon Leake wins America's Got Talent. Nobody wins America's Got Talent by saying poetry, but he did. David Foster Wallace gives a speech that, as Time magazine said, sounds more like a suicide note than this usual motivational speech. And he's put at the top. What the hell is water? It's recognizing this is water as the automatic. And the ability to de-automatize defines our ability to innovate, defines our ability to create. The key to innovation in verbal science, creativity in verbal art, is our ability to recognize, create the automatic. To recognize it. This is water. To create it and then de-automatize against it. That's foregrounding. by thinking grammatically, how much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? We can get some of it. As I said, I'm so interested to read your commentaries because I'm interested in what you will be contributing to this discussion. But it's not just not finding just patterns, but it's finding where is the pattern leading you. All right, now this is my last lecture. All right, for the I'm teaching 2 courses this semester, and tonight is the last one for our course, but it's also I'm retiring at the end of this semester, so I will not be teaching again. And so this is my last time to teach this course and I've appreciated you as a class and appreciated the work that you have put into the course. And I wanted to just end with at least what I'm going to present to you. I'll leave some time for questions and so forth. But I just leave you with this video.
Too much to say, too much to lose. I get frustrated thinking about the world I brought you to. It's a battle of time that I have with you. We don't decide the how, the when, or if we make it through. I feel that you deserve a chance to know the truth and to be better than the ones who came before you, only to let pride and money weaken them. So be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Yeah, be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. So many words veiling the truth. The earth is turning and it's time for us to choose. And people will try to take you down too. But if I was a betting man, I'd put all my money on you. I know that I have nothing left to give to you to make you better than the man I failed to be, the friend and father that I know I should have been. So be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Yeah, be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Nobody knows what to say, nobody shows you the way. Sometimes it's hard to see who you're gonna be. So be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Love.
So let me just end with this this quote. I would define the poetic effect as the capacity that a text displays for continuing to generate different readings without ever being completely consumed. It's sort of the idea that Edwin Tumbu said that what releases the poem into a form of immortality. It's what, hopefully, what we begin to see is something of what makes meaning. We never will see the whole thing, but that's hopefully what you have learned is something that will help you to understand what language is better and how language works. So thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Webster. Thank you for the song. And can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Yes. I've got a few questions about the previous the presentation. And firstly, it's about the cohesiveness and the coherence. Can I say it's better to see these two polar as a continuum rather than a clear cut or discrete entity?
Certainly, both of them contribute. They're necessary to go with each other in the sense that cohesiveness, basically, I see as defining I'm going to be looking in this direction because I'm on the screen here. I can see you. Let me just, if I may, Shen Mingming, hold on a second.
Yes, no problem.
I'm going to, instead of the share screen, I'm going to change it, and then I can see. Yeah, okay, that's better. Okay, cohesion, I see, is helping us to define what are the constituents of the text. Because the patterning, we see the pattern, just like we've been looking at Brandon Leake's Pookie text, you see certain parts that sort of have an identity. The cohesiveness, the patterning is what gives those parts their identity. But then all that we're seeing are parts within the larger text. But those parts somehow have to relate one to the other. How do they come together? That's the coherence. So they are not in any way sort of separate kinds of things. You cannot really have a coherence without a cohesiveness. I do think you can have a cohesiveness without coherence, because you could identify the various parts, but which none of them sort of connect up one to the other. So you have, like, all disconnected. So you can have a text with a lot of cohesiveness, but no coherence. It's possible.
So I can see, like, from the level of process to the test, like this sense of cohesiveness gradually change it to the sense of coherence.
I see the coherence as relations. I see the cohesiveness as patterns. Okay, does that help, in the sense that the coherence defines relations between parts of a text? The parts of the text are defined by their cohesiveness.
Yes. Okay, understood. So speaking of the logical relations, can we say RST theory is semantic in defining the logical relations, but the systemic functional theory is defining the logical relations from the perspective of lexical grammar?
Yes, yes. And so that's why the relations as they're defined in RST are not defined at all in terms of grammar, all completely in terms of meaning. Like the writer has positive regard for this, right? So it's all defined in terms of the intention of also in terms of the response. So the relations, you'll notice, are also defined by that the reader will, I forget how it was worded in some cases, but the reader will agree with the writer. All right, that's the purpose of what the writer is trying to achieve. So it's identified in terms of intention and response, in terms of RST, which all comes back to meaning.
So it really taps onto meaning, and this isn't what SF.
Because Halliday's view all along. That's why he made the comments he did about appraisal, but he also made the same comments about RST, in the sense that what Halliday felt was you need to approach this completely empirically. Empirically means you have evidence. It's not just your subjective judgment. If it's to be more empirical, then the grammar is what's giving you the realization. That's real, that's visible. And that's how we should be approaching language.
And that's why it's better to combine these two to assess the text.
But at the same time, Halliday also says the text is a semantic unit, right? So how do we get at the text then? Because the whole point is we don't want to just get to the clause. We need to begin to see beyond the patterning that occurs. Hassan does this when she's looking at the poetry. She's looking at how the messages come together, the patterning, and it creates a pattern, right? Which then she looks at in terms of the foregrounding against that pattern. So she's looking at the text as a whole. It's true. She's looking at it as an extended metaphor. And she's doing it in terms of the grammar, all still in terms of the grammar. But what RST is saying is if the text is a semantic unit, then we need a method, we need an approach that will complement what Halliday was doing, and indeed allow us to now describe the text.
So I noticed that when you were analyzing the text with RST theory, sometimes it's analyzed on the level of clauses, sometimes it's on paragraph. There isn't a consistency throughout the text. So it's okay to, right?
I don't catch what you mean. What do you mean?
So for example, sometimes the relation is defined between the clauses within a sentence.
Oh, yes.
And sometimes it's defined between the paragraphs. And there isn't a consistency throughout.
The way I see it is that when we're talking about the logical structuring, it exists between functionally significant spans. What's a functionally significant span? Clauses are definitely functionally significant spans, but we also have logical connections between larger chunks, which may be paragraphs, which may be on and on hierarchically up to the text as a whole. So for example, when I talk about thematic progression, you'll notice that I sometimes talk about theme as being something that is at the beginning of a paragraph and how it connected with what was in the previous paragraph. Because I see the whole notion of thematic progression as also being not just at the level of clause, but at the level of any functionally significant span.
So in terms of functional significant span, it is consistent.
Yes.
Okay. And I also wonder why, because we are using this concept of foregrounding and backgrounding to assess the literary pieces, and why can we apply it to, for example, the presidential speech or debate? Why can we apply?
Why can't we apply it?
Why can't we apply it to?
Do they have a deeper meaning? I mean, that would be to say that, okay, well, I mean, the whole point of now,
I got it.
Honest, no, but let me take this, all right? Don't. It is a kind of, I would say, Trump, David Foster Wallace, they are doing de-automatization. Now, there is a reason for it. There's a functional value that when Trump is doing it, I don't think it's aesthetic, but there is a purpose. There is a purpose. So it has a functional value. I don't think it has an aesthetic value, but it's a kind of anti-text. That's what, in many cases, I think in some cases, Trump was trying to appeal to an audience which was anti-intellectual, which was against sort of people that were educated and things like that. Anti-elite. That was his, and that's why he's trying to appeal.
Wow. Okay. So generally, because the genre other than literature, generally they don't have a deeper meaning there. So we don't.
They may have a deeper meaning, but not aesthetically. All right.
So because the not aesthetically, so we don't use foregrounding and backgrounding to assess.
We can simply use de-automatization. It's the same thing. And that's what Halliday's point was. What Halliday is saying is, well, it's foregrounding is de-automatization. Grammatical metaphor is de-automatization. It's all de-automatization. It's all, whether it's recognizing that this is the automatic, and then you're going against the automatic. For the poet is doing it in order to draw your attention to a particular meaning.
Yes.
To create a metaphor that extends throughout the text.
Yes. Then what about the pieces other than the literary pieces? Is there the automatization there?
There may be. That's why I say when we look at Trump, when we look at David Foster Wallace, I do think there's what they're doing is going against they're contrasting with what is normally done in order to, for some purpose.
Were received. The last one, a very small one. So we were talking about the Trump speech to the CIA, and I noticed that we attribute the first person plural to his like the telling of his own story, but I wonder, because normally we attribute we as a factor to connecting to audience, and it's like it's a good factor in terms of interpersonal meaning. But why do we attribute first personal plural to his telling of his own story?
Is it? I think it was the first person singular. I'm not sure why you infer that it's the first person plural. He uses that in the speech to Congress. In the speech to Congress, then he's making a connection with the people, with the Congress. It's working together to achieve something, right? So in that, which was more presidential, then he is using the we. But when it's not, when it's like the speech to the CIA, it's I.
Okay.
First person singular.
Yes. Then I got it, understood. Thank you for your time.
Sure.
And I really like your lecture. Very lucky to be one of your last lectures of students. Good health in the coming days, in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for very good questions. Anybody
Professor
else?
Webster, can I
Yes.
ask a question?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you fine.
Yeah. So as our text is about, our course is about text linguistics, but I am not sure is that what is the relationship between text linguistics and SFL? Can we say like text linguistics is a methodology and SFL is theoretical framework, or?
Yeah. What I'd say is that there would be different ways to approach texts. There has been, one can argue that pragmatics looks at text. There's people that do what are called discourse analysis, all right?
I see.
But then the why I adopt a SFL framework for approaching the text is because in a way it does seem to provide a way to really, as Halliday himself says, to be able to get beyond just sort of an ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, as he puts it, and to give a way to be able to compare texts in a way that you can do your analysis, I can do the analysis. If we're looking at it from terms of transitivity and mood, modality, theme, we're going to come to the same analysis.
Yes.
We're going to be able to compare. So you can look at some kind of text and I can look at another kind of text and we can compare. We can sort of also have a way to compare text. So I can compare, go back to Trump, for example. How is he different than other presidents? I have a means to do so. And the means to do so is through what Halliday provides, the grammar, grammatiques, as he puts it, which I do feel really does help us approach it in a more objective, empirical way. It really is getting at meaning, but getting at meaning through actually what we're doing with the language, the grammar, the lexicogrammar, the wording. So I approach it through SFL. Are there other ways to approach it? Yes, I'm sure there are. But there's an interesting, you know, that one example that I've used for rhetorical structure theory, that ZPG letter. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, there's a book, and this book takes that text, the ZPG letter, and it has a whole range of different people. Halliday is one, rhetorical structure theory is another, and they're all approaching the same text, but from their different theoretical frameworks. So there are different theoretical frameworks to look at text and look at discourse. And it just so happens that I found SFL, and that's why I think it works well, and that's why I teach it.
I learned a written discourse analysis before, and I found that although we write the same assignment to the same text, but our classmates do not have the same like analysis objectively. But SFL is more like helpful for us to kind of like scaffold it in a more objective way.
I hope so.
I also have a question about academic writing. So,
and Hannah, by the way, I will come back to you on the other material that you sent me. So, but now I know what you look like. So, by the way, everyone, Hannah is a PhD student, and she's doing her PhD, and she's also sitting in this course, and she's working on academic text. So, Hannah, I interrupted you. What was your question?
Sorry, I'm so shy now.
No, come on.
Yeah, so in academic writing, Halliday says more normalization can cause the text become more academic. But what about course? Can we say that if there are more embedded course where it become more academic for the text? Your experience as a professor.
No, I think so, definitely. Because a large part of the nominalization is also embedding clauses as post-modification of within a noun phrase, right? And it is the rank shifting that basically you're talking about that becomes a kind of embedding that extends the phrases to become very complex and very then lexically dense. So it's all part of the whole idea of sort of grammatical metaphor. It's turning clauses into almost functioning like nouns. So the whole idea of grammatical metaphor then is does involve sometimes a kind of embedding. So definitely in the language of science, we notice a lot of that.
I watched one of your videos in YouTube, and you say that you enjoy writing. When you write a draft, you will revise it and look back on it again and again, right?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I have learned from it, and I'm now trying to improve my Tamil writing as well.
When I look at that's one bit of advice. When you write something, put it aside for a day or two, and then go back to read it. Because when you read it, you're going to, does that make sense at all? I mean, what seems so obvious immediately when we're writing it, we think, oh, that's the best perfect way of writing. You go back
Yes.
2 or 3 days later and you look at it and oh, it's awful. So yeah, that's how I feel. All right. And so definitely we're like the poet,
Mm,
constant revision. All right.
okay.
The perfect paper is future tense. Okay.
Yeah, as a non-native speaker, sometimes I ask native speakers to help me do some proofreadings, and I will like memorize their expressions. What are the
That's
differences between their and mine?
oh, that's very good. That's a very good way to learn. And
Yeah.
that's, I mean, I'm in a way learning like that too when I read,
Oh,
because I do think that's one reason why people's writing nowadays is becoming, oh, what should I say? It's, I think it's badly affected by the fact that we don't read as much as people used to.
mm,
And our reading, you know, I mean, reading something, social media doesn't mean anything. What you really need to read is, the more you read, the more you observe the patterns and see how people use it. And it's something that you begin to acquire. So sometimes I feel the best way to learn how to write is to read more.
yeah, yeah, I agree with this.
Mm.
Yeah, and last question is about um what are the heated topics about SFL currently, or like do you like suggest any future directions about SFL for us to explore? In a lecture, I asked a professor about this question as well, but he said before Halliday's passed away, I'm not going to offend, but he said Halliday would like to search some empirical evidence to prove the existence of SFL. So do you agree with this statement? I am not kind of agree with it.
Hannah, my phone
Sorry.
rang just as you were
So,
talking. Do you mind to tell me, say it again? I'm very sorry. Forgive me.
no, I'm very sorry. My question could be too long. Like,
No, no, no,
so,
no. But
uh,
I think I'd like to hear the question though, again.
okay, so, my question is that, what are the heated topic of SFL currently, or like, can you suggest any future direction about SFL for us to discover? Because in a lecture, I asked another professor about this question as well, and he said before Halliday passed away, I'm not going to offend, but I'm just paraphrase. And he said Halliday would like to search some empirical evidence to prove the existence or the science of SFL. Do you agree with this statement? I am not kind of agree with it, but I think I am not. I don't have any idea about this.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about where the theory needs to be developed more,
Yes.
one area I think is, as I mentioned in the lecture earlier, interpersonal meaning.
Oh,
I think
interpersonal.
it's one of the sort of weak points in the theory, because Halliday didn't go much into it except mood, modality, and so forth. But there's obviously so much more. Jim
Yes.
Martin went on with appraisal, but appraisal also is, as I said, is so subjective and so difficult
Mm.
to find two analysts that analyze
Yes.
it the same way. So to me, that doesn't work. So that's, I think, one aspect that really needs to be improved. The other
Mm.
is, I've always myself been interested in, is being able to apply. I mean, if you want to do a large scale analysis,
Mm.
to be able to automate,
Automate. Yeah.
you know, the computational aspect of it. I mean,
Like a
that
corpus.
exactly. But and to, if you really want to look at language, you really do need to see a corpus. But how do you analyze a large scale corpus with an SFL, FFG kind of analysis,
Yeah.
which is so often has to be done manually, right?
Yes.
But how could that maybe be automated in a way that it could be then extended, and we could have large-scale analysis, and on that basis would have a much wider view of how a text, you know, how to compare texts.
Yeah, that is a problem because like for lots of corpus, maybe analyzing it in SFL could be kind of more qualitative and manually. So
Yeah,
if there
right.
is any truth computational.
True.
Thank you for your
Okay.
question. I
Sure.
will stay here for a while, so like let others students ask question first. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Professor Webster, I got a question.
Yes.
Hi. So we just I think Hannah and you were just talking about interpersonal, and I think in the text of science or like in general, like these kind of text, academic texts, then interpersonal doesn't really exist. But in verbal art or like a speech or like the president and stuff, the text with purpose, then there's kind of appearing interpersonals, like there actually are interpersonals, right? So I was wondering how, like whether not the text itself, you know, in words, but the performance of the text, like how do they perform, like for example, the pitch and the use of interpersonal, in these, like it should be counted as like the performance of the text other than the text itself. It should also be a part of the text.
Yes.
I was just wondering this.
Yeah, I mean, what you are comparing is you take Brandon Leake's performance. There's so much going on there that we are not getting at because we're not getting at the voice, the use of gesture. There's so many other ways in which he's adding meaning to the text, and I tried in looking at the speed, for example. All right, and but that is an obvious area which one needs to be able to go beyond. Halliday was great at that because Halliday was so good at being able to hear the intonation, and he brought that aspect to it. And there are texts that he's analyzed in that sense. In the language of science, of course, because it's written, so you don't have that sort of spoken element to it, the voice quality, the rhythm, things like that. You begin to see it though when you're looking at a text like, okay, even Obama. There is an element there where he is being persuasive, so that there is an interpersonal meaning there. I wouldn't say that you started off by saying, well, there's not so much interpersonal meaning in the language of science. There is, but it's kept, I mean, it's less noticeable.
Yeah.
So if you want to persuade someone, you want them to sort of be assured of something, you say, you don't say I think, or like that. You just say it is likely that. Okay, so you use kind of interpersonal metaphor that comes at it sort of indirectly while you are persuading them, while you are expressing attitude. You're doing so in a way that's sort of kept low profile.
Yeah, even if like the use of passive voice, like a lot of passive voice in a science text,
Exactly.
they also
to keep the researcher is out of the picture, so to speak, right?
Right.
But it's, yeah, you are persuading, you are trying to get across a point of view, you are trying to and that does require a kind of interpersonal meaning to express the attitude, but it's done in a different manner than how we would do it perhaps by voice.
Right. So you mean the control, like the performance in the verbal art is just one way to show the like the interpersonal value, but not the only way, right?
Exactly. And that's why I say whenever we do our analysis, I'm saying that what we're getting out of it is some of it. We're not getting the whole thing. There's more to it. That's why I say I'm looking forward to the commentaries that you all are writing, because I'm sure I've only started looking at them, and from the 2 or 3 that I've seen so far, I can see things that have been noticed, and I look forward to what you wrote and what your other classmates have written as well.
Yeah, because I was basically like, for one point I was paying attention to the pitch, and I did some like the pitch analysis, and I see the part that have like hypotaxis is the point that where the speaker have the highest pitch on average. So yeah, that's why I'm asking this question. So
okay, well,
whether it's considered
I'll be looking
part of the
forward
text.
to reading that then. So
Okay.
I haven't read it yet, so I'll look forward to that. That's good.
Okay, thank you,
Sure.
and have a nice retirement.
Thank you. Thank you.